This is precisely the reign of revenge that for months I have warned against. A reign of revenge that would rip the country further and further into two jagged halves, and from there into a genuine hot civil war.
And now, The Edwin Black Show. Sponsored by the Books of Edwin Black, available on Amazon and at booksellers worldwide. And now, here's Edwin.
Welcome to the Edwin Black Show. I'm Edwin Black, investigative journalist and historian, and author of IBM and the Holocaust, which earlier this month was declared by Amazon to be the #1 best-selling volume on World War II history. Also, my book, War Against Weak and Financing the Flames, many other volumes. If you like what this show is doing, tell a friend and subscribe for passwords at theedwinblackshow.com. We're happy to have solidarity today from such fine national organizations as Emmett and Scholars for Peace in the Middle East. If you have a question limited to today's topic, place one sentence, repeat one sentence in Zoom's QA feature. No comments or opinions, please, because then we can't see the question. The Edwin Black Show is growing globally. We speak frankly, without partisanship, to a fragmented world seeking better understanding of our tormented past, our present very, very tense, and a future still uncertain. Now for today's frightening episode, assessing how our divided nation continues to split in two and now is said by many to be approaching a police state. Even as the revenge machine rises, and even as we see a blatantly illegal impeachment for former President Trump. We care about these threats not because of party politics or partisanship, but because one party now has the power. This means what? This means one party controls all three branches of government, enjoys the active collaboration of most of the corporate media to ignore and amplify news as needed, has cemented a partnership with the invasive control and censorship technocracy of Silicon Valley, and now works with a partisan intelligence community, which has just adopted a domestic spying agenda bigger than ever before. This combination of threats caused Hawaii Democrat Tulsi Gabbard to proclaim this week, quote, "The mob who stormed the Capitol to try to stop Congress from carrying out its constitutional responsibilities," said Gabbard, "were behaving like domestic enemies of our country. But let us be clear," she adds, "the John Brennans, Adam Schiffs, and the oligarchs in big tech who are trying to undermine our constitutionally protected rights and turn our country into a police state with KGB-style surveillance are also domestic enemies and much more powerful and therefore more dangerous than the mob which stormed the Capitol," close quote. And she was a Democratic contender for the presidency. Democratic Gabbard was referring to strong suggestions by top members of the intelligence community that they need to start targeting so-called domestic terrorists, loosely defined as white supremacists and racists, which the Biden administration and media personalities have suggested fits the glove of tens of millions of Americans who voted for Trump. They believe the Trump path needs to be permanently deplatformed, pauperized, punished for life, and then deprogrammed and eventually reprogrammed. This is precisely the reign of revenge that for months I have warned against. A reign of revenge that would rip the country further and further into two jagged halves, and from there into a genuine hot civil war. What could this police state look like and inflict? We have many examples in history, but we need not look to Stalin, the Third Reich, East Germany, North Korea, or Greece under the military dictator Papadopoulos. we can stare deeply into the mirror, past our own image, and directly into America's past. The Red Scare during World War I years, where we feared a communist takeover, that led to the Espionage Act of 1917, the Sedition Act of 1918. Sedition criminalized, quote, any disloyal, profane, scurrilous, or abusive language about the U.S. government or military. Thousands of protesters were arrested, many in nighttime home invasions known as the Palmer Raids, as well as hundreds convicted before sedition was finally repealed. It took courage to oppose Attorney General Palmer. The media enthusiastically endorsed this censorship, but Francis Fisher Kane, the U.S. Attorney for the Eastern District of Pennsylvania, resigned in protest. His letter of resignation to the president and the Attorney General wrote, quote, people not really guilty are likely to be arrested and railroaded through their hearings. We appear to be attempting to repress a political party and make dangerous what was not dangerous before. Here's another. The state of Virginia's eugenic detectives under Walter Plecker, who searched high and low looking for so-called criminal race mixers so he could cancel their marriages and destroy their living arrangements. Or the Japanese who were sent to concentration camps. Or McCarthy demanding to know, have you now or ever been a member of the Communist Party? I grew up in the 50s when the Jews were thought to be hidden agents of Moscow. My immigrant parents and I were afraid of our shadow, afraid to talk on the phone. It was not just Jews, it was also the civil rights movement. J. Edgar Hoover and the FBI tapped Martin Luther King's telephone. When I was a two-fisted investigative reporter in Chicago, I investigated the Chicago Police Department's Red Squad, that is, the intelligence unit operating behind unmarked doors on the 9th floor of police headquarters on South State Street. After the 1969 Democratic Convention riot, the Red Squad infiltrated every local book club, political organization, social club, and civil rights activity in Chicago. A few years ago, when I successfully investigated the FBI's chief of counterintelligence, and I investigated him for anti-Semitic activities, I found that one Jewish analyst had been targeted as a possible spy merely because he attended his nephew's bar mitzvah in Israel. If 75 million average Americans are the new terrorists, the intelligence community will plant undercover operatives in local political groups, as was done to every Muslim mosque and Islamic group after 9/11 in the so-called war against terror. Our phones will be tapped. Agent provocateurs will try to egg on and draw out what they call terrorists, as they do now for Muslims. And the authority for all this is already being sought, and not by the FBI, but by a special panel at the National Security Council, a so-called advisory group, which is working in secret and reporting to the president. The revenge machine accelerates even as we discuss this. And now China is pulling its own set of strings in our own cancel culture. How? China has imposed sanctions on former Trump personalities. Any law firm, commercial entity, or publisher will also be sanctioned by the Communist Party, and therefore must be willing to cut itself off for China's money tree. Correct? From Beijing, the Communist Party can impose its economic revenge on thousands of American citizens who we can hire and which books we can read. Understand, a strange stereopticon has developed between the revenge Democrats and the Chinese Communist Party. This convergence, no doubt, has been enhanced by such California officials as Representative Eric Swalwell, remember Chinese honey trap Fang Fang? Dianne Feinstein, remember her spy chauffeur of many years? And Nancy Pelosi, who for some reason still unexplained, danced in Chinatown to fight back against the Wuhan virus. Now China is letting it be known that unfriendly statements by even very local elected officials will not be forgotten, and friendly talk will be rewarded. The Communist Party funds companies that donate to political campaigns. And here's a footnote. Remember when it was racist to say the Wuhan virus or the China virus? Yet now it's perfectly okay to refer to the British variant and the South African variant. One half of the divided nation sees a long-awaited reckoning, a desire for justice, and the other sees a double standard and a fast-approaching threat. The Chinese social credit system is coming to our shore. This is the system of Communist Party compliance rating matched to massive omnipresent facial recognition that keeps ordinary Chinese citizens off buses, off airplanes, off trains, and off everyday activities. This is now being talked about here with no fly list to even include Senator Ted Cruz and the establishment of our own algorithm ghettos. The sandpaper on the wound of disunion is censorship. I and many others see a 1984-style censorship fast approaching, where words, phrases, opinions, thoughts, and even memoirs are effectively banned and then erased. The powers that have emerged cannot erase the disagreeable or even the awful. How is history to investigate the Third Reich, eugenics, racism, and conflict if the words have been redacted from the record? Cross-examination is the essence of justice. Dissent is the quintessence of enlightenment. A free, honest, and vibrant press is the indispensable active ingredient in any democracy. Yet the media as we knew it is gone. The majority of those polled believe the news is being rigged for political purposes. The factions are ready for battle. According to many overlapping polls, as many as 90% of Trump supporters still believe the election was rigged, and they believe this primarily because some 300 Democratic lawsuits unconstitutionally changed the rules at the last minute. The country is divided like never before. Budweiser will not even run a Super Bowl ad for the first time in 37 years. Ditto Pepsi and Coke. And insiders believe these advertisers fear someone will be hyper offended no matter what the message is. I was struck this week by the remarks of noted pollster Frank Luntz. He conducted a focus group, 50-50, Biden and Trump voters. The gathering was toxic. See it online, just search it out, as people started to insult and attack each other. Luntz says he can no longer endure the anxiety of polling. He can no longer bring people together by exploring attitudes. Luntz says, quote, they don't just disagree, they hate each other. And now we have an illegal and unconstitutional snap impeachment to further singe the youth. The House indicted with no lawyer to present evidence, no debate, no due process, and now a fake impeachment to remove a president already out of office that the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court said he will not attend, and 45 senators have already stated they would vote against. So why? What Congress now plans is specifically and vibrantly banned by the Constitution in 2 locations. If this goes forward, why not retroactively impeach JFK for philandering, FDR for maintaining a segregated army, or Woodrow Wilson for his brutal response to urban riots? In fact, Joe Biden has already been referred for impeachment by a newly sworn-in Republican based on misconduct with China during the Obama administration. To tackle it all, we have some of the finest minds in the nation. Joining us today, arguably America's most sought-after crisis manager from Herald Strategies, frequent panelist, my friend, Juda Engelmayer. Also my friend and frequent show panelist, Josh Block. Foreign Policy Magazine named him one of the top 100 foreign policy voices. Block served as a State Department spokesman and was a spokesman for the Clinton, Gore, and Gore-Lieberman presidential campaigns. Here also, esteemed threat analyst Kenneth Abramowitz, author of The Multifront War, a book that seems more apt than ever. Plus 2 of America's best constitutional minds, renowned jurist and frequent panelist and friend Alan Dershowitz, who hosts The Dershow on Rumble and YouTube. And starting us off today will be my friend, famed constitutional authority, Nathan Lewin, who will tell us exactly why the forthcoming impeachment effort grievously violates the Constitution. Take it away, Nat.
Thank you very much, Edwin, for that very flattering introduction. My friend and colleague, Alan Dershowitz, and other constitutional scholars, Ken Starr, Michael Luddig, who was a judge on the Court of Appeals, have made the point very strongly that the impeachment clause of the Constitution does not authorize an impeachment of someone who is not in office. But I think my view is that there's an even more fundamental reason why this prospective trial of Donald J. Trump is unconstitutional. And that's because there is a very flat prohibition in the Constitution, not in Section 3 of Article 1, but in Sections 8 and 9 of Article 1 against bills of attainder. The Constitution clearly says no bill of attainder or ex post facto law shall be passed by Congress. And then in Section 10, it makes the same prohibition with regard to state legislatures. What is a bill of attainder? I'll tell you, I represented Richard Nixon after he resigned the presidency in arguing to the Supreme Court of the United States that the taking of his papers was a bill of attainder. This was a very serious contention. It took many pages by the Supreme Court to reject that argument that we made in the Supreme Court on behalf of Richard Nixon. And the reason it was rejected, and the Solicitor General of the United States very specifically stated, was that taking papers in order to safeguard them and go through them and then ultimately release them back to Richard Nixon was not a punishment. Solicitor General McCree said this is not a bill of attainder because it's not a punishment. What is a punishment? The Supreme Court has very clearly stated that legislative acts, no matter what their form, that apply either to named individuals or to easily ascertainable members of group in such a way as to inflict punishment on them without a judicial trial, is a bill of attainder. The senators, several senators have said they're proud of the fact that they've been impaneled, and this is Democratic senators have said, as jurors. Well, that's exactly what the Constitution prohibits. The determination of whether Donald J. Trump incited insurrection on January 6, 2021 may, under the Constitution, only be decided by a court of law, with a jury deciding it, and with a judge, and with examination of witnesses, admission only of testimony and evidence that's admissible. The legislature may act on an impeachment. That's an exception to the rule prohibiting bills of attainder. And nowhere does the Constitution say that a procedure like impeachment, if done after the person leaves office, will be an exception to the flat prohibition against bills of attainder. When the Senate will be deciding on February 9 and hearing evidence, if evidence is presented, or hearing argument, if argument is presented, as to whether Donald J. Trump is guilty of inciting an insurrection, it will be doing something that the founding fathers have said can only be done by an Article 3 court, by a court of the United States. That's how guilt or innocence, when punishment is going to be inflicted, is done. And that's so clear in terms of the Constitution that I'm amazed that leading scholars on the Constitution have barely mentioned Bill of Attainder. My friend Alan Dershowitz did mention it in passing in a recent piece that he wrote. But other than that, everybody seems to be questioning whether impeachment may extend to this. It's clearly, I think, a bill of attainder if the Senate determines that Donald J. Trump is guilty of inciting an insurrection. And the Senate may not constitutionally conduct such a proceeding.
Right. Okay. And for everyone, we are waiting for Alan Dershowitz to come on. He's had some technical difficulties, but we're trying to get him. Judah or Eve, if you can get that by email to him. So what you're saying is that under the Constitution, the Senate cannot try somebody in like a jury trial, and that constitutes a bill of attainder, and that is illegal, correct?
If there's punishment, yes. In other words, and the result here is clearly punishment under the cases that the Supreme Court has decided. As a matter of fact, the leading case before the Nixon case was a case involving a man by the name of Archie Brown. And it was stated, the Supreme Court held it to be a bill of attainder because the law said that anyone who had been a member of the Communist Party could not be a union official. And the Supreme Court said that that is a punishment, that the disqualification becomes a punishment.
And in fact, if I'm not mistaken, there is anticipated a punishment for Trump in that they would find him guilty of sedition, which under the 14th would stop him from running again for any.
Of course, the
higher
punishment for Trump would be at least as great as the punishment was for Archie Brown in the case of that preceded Nixon, in the Brown case in the Supreme Court, where the Supreme Court held that was a bill of attainder because he was kept from holding office after that.
Okay.
So
All right. So we're going to hear from Alan on that same subject. We'll, as soon as he gets in, Judah, help him get in. And now we're going to go to Josh. And Josh, you've seen how bad things are getting, especially with the media and the tearing apart of the two halves of the country. You know both communities. What's your opening statement?
Well, I am hard pressed to understand what the great advantage for the Democrats is to press ahead with this impeachment case. Now the guy's out of office at a time when Biden's trying to accomplish so many things in his agenda, and he says unify the country. I'm not sure what the upside is, and given the constitutional conundrum that Nat describes, where the outcome isn't the constitutionally, described removal from office, but some other punishment, that it even adds even greater question to why we're wasting so much political energy continuing these fights and not just moving on. The other thing I'd note, and it has to do with media coverage, is the language that the press is using to describe Donald Trump. It certainly is definitive in terms of I was watching CNN earlier today. And again, since there's impeachment going on, I guess the way they talk about things, maybe it matters. He invited his crowd to DC. He stirred them up. He started the insurrection. They're laying a lot of blame on him directly in this media conversation. I'm sure it's not just CNN. I'm sure there's many others out there as they write it up that are assigning blame, or isn't that what's kind of at question in some of these things? I don't know. The whole thing feels like it takes on unnecessary momentum in a negative direction. It brings out negativity from the media and negativity in the political space when people could be focused on policy issues that advance the interests of the American people and aren't looking backward.
Okay, well, I think that's valid, and I think many would agree with you, and there would probably be many on the other side of this argument who would say the Democrats were constantly talking about violence and getting in your face and things of that nature. Now we've got Alan Dershowitz who's just joined us. Hey, Alan, thanks a lot. Unmute yourself. Alan, How's the new show, the Dershow?
Oh, we're loving it every day. And I get, it's Dershow, and all it's missing is the wits. And the wits is provided by my listeners and viewers. And we have all kinds of controversial arguments, and we have law seminars. Today, I put a hypothetical to the students, my listeners. If you could impeach Mr. Trump, can the Senate also can the House impeach Hillary Clinton for what she did when she was Secretary of State?
Oh, you just missed my introduction. I said we should go back and impeach JFK and even Woodrow Wilson.
No, you have to be alive, because there has to be a remedy, and there are only two remedies: one, removal, and the other is disqualification. And removal doesn't apply if you're no longer in office, but disqualification could. But if you're dead, you can't be disqualified either, at least from this heavenly office. You have to. But look, I think it's also a bill of attainder.
Before you go on, Nat just suggested that you would say bill of attainder is the constitutional bar. He spoke about that vibrantly. So please continue on why a bill of attainder disqualifies what they're doing.
Well, first of all, I've known Nat Lewin for 60 years. I don't think I've ever disagreed with him, even once. Once we had an argument about Hanukkah menorahs in public places, but he won that debate. But we haven't had much disagreement since. So I don't know exactly what his views on Bill of Attainder are, but I am actually an expert on Bill of Attainders. I edited my first law review article on Bill of Attainders in 1960. So we're going back 60 years, and I studied the whole history of a Bill of Attainder. And basically, the Bill of Attainder is a prohibition against legislative trials. You can't put people on trial by the legislature if there's any kind of a punitive consequence. And the courts have held that disqualification from future jobs is a punitive aspect of Bill of Attainder. So unless there's an exception, and there's an exception obviously for impeachment, but the exception is limited to removal from office. So you can't just put ordinary people, even former office holders, on trial in the Senate without violating the Bill of Attainder provision. So look, I think there are so many reasons why this trial in the Senate is unconstitutional. Bill of Attainder is only one of them. The text of the Constitution itself, the meaning of the Constitution, and people go back and say, but the British, people forget we fought a revolution to get us out from under the British experience. We did not want to emulate. Britain allowed Bill of Attainders. Britain allowed impeachment of people who left office. Britain allowed impeachment for maladministration. There's no comparison between impeachment under British law. Remember, prime ministers didn't get impeached, cabinet members. Impeachment was only for low-ranking officials. Prime ministers, you can get rid of them just by a vote of no confidence. So using the English experience is misusing history. We have to look at our own Constitution, the words of our Constitution, and I think it's at least a very close question as to whether the Senate has jurisdiction. But if you listen to Majority Leader Schumer, it's not a close question because he has all these scholars telling him that you can do it. But let's look at who these scholars are. These scholars are people who would be exactly on the other side if the shoe were on the other foot. If this were Hillary Clinton who were being impeached, or if this were President Biden who were being impeached, or Bill Clinton, or Barack Obama, they would all be saying, oh, no, you can't do that. They would be adopting all of my arguments. They do not pass the shoe on the other foot test. They use their scholarly reputations and associations as a cover for their political views. The foremost proponent of this is Professor Lawrence Tribe, who never found a constitutional provision that didn't exactly fit his ideological and political preferences. It's amazing that every single partisan political issue that he supports, he can find a way of stretching, pulling, tugging, reinterpreting, destroying the Constitution to make it come out that way. And you should have him on the show. I challenge him.
I think I got a phone call from him waiting because he says, I'm going to tell Alan what for. Now, look, I find it remarkable. I find it remarkable that you weren't even on the show, and you echoed exactly what Nat Lewin said. In his experience, I'll let him reply in a minute, he actually defended Nixon. So I think he beat you by a couple of years. Go ahead, Nat.
Well, my qualification is, of course, not as good as the qualification of the editor of the Yale Law Journal that my friend Alan Dershowitz was when he wrote his piece on Bill of Attainder. All I did is I argued the leading Bill of Attainder case in the Supreme Court of the United States, in the case of Richard Nixon. And
Right.
I said, I guess before you were on the program, Alan, in perfect congruence with your position as a student, that this will clearly be the Senate enacting, if it will not do it because it won't get a 2/3 Republican majority, 2/3 of vote of the Senate. But if they did it, it would be the clearest case of Bill of Attainder under the leading Supreme Court cases.
Right.
The Brown case, which I think came down probably after you and I graduated law school, but that was decided before Nixon, was a case in which the Supreme Court held that disqualifying somebody from office, a union office, because he had been a member of the Communist Party was a Bill of Attainder.
Right.
And therefore, if the Senate of the United States were now to say that Richard Nixon, and they seem to be proud that they're going to be jurors, if that jury were to decide that Richard Nixon incited an insurrection on January 6th, they're doing what only a jury can do under the Constitution, and what a
I agree.
legislature may not do.
Okay.
But
we're gonna move
there's
on.
a connection.
All right, go ahead.
There.
Al.
Let me just follow up on this. There's a connection. So the man who actually wrote the article on Bill of Attainder was the famous constitutional law scholar, John Hart Ely. He was the writer and I was the editor, and we worked together on that article. Then he became the law clerk to Chief Justice Warren, and he drafted the opinion in the Brown case based on the article that we had jointly written on Bill of Attainder. So there's a close connection. Look, you never, ever have to waste time and money having me and Nat Lewin on your show together, because you can have either one of us. We always come out exactly the same way. We went to the same yeshiva. We went to Yeshiva University High School. He was smart enough to get into Yeshiva University College. I was turned down from Yeshiva University College. I was the first person ever turned down from Yeshiva College. I established their admissions department because they never had an admissions department. Until I applied, they just accepted everybody. But I got turned down.
The reason,
All right, guys.
But I have been learning at his knee ever since.
I'm going to serve scotch later after the show. We can all have a.
But I have to tell you that the reason Alan was rejected had nothing to do with his intellectual qualities. It was only that he was at the very early stage of what he has become during the rest of his life, a terrific troublemaker and a great advocate and a great debater. And for that reason, he angered his faculty people in high school. And they thought that Yeshiva College should not have such a very difficult, contentious personality.
Okay, now let's go to Judah. Wait a minute. Ken, get back into the picture. Ken, let's move into one of your areas of expertise. You published a book some months ago called The Multifront War, and I'm moving away from this impeachment business to part of what we're talking about, this police state, and we're talking about the China threat. And you predicted that there would be this confluence of China threats, including something called the Confucius Institutes on campus. There were hundreds of them. Briefly, can you tell us about that?
Sure. Well, the Chinese influence is everywhere in this country, and it's accelerating its impact. President Trump tried to hold back the China influence. President Biden's accelerating the China influence. So it's very disturbing because China has a system that's basically the opposite of America. In a democracy, we, the people, are at the top, so to speak, and we tell the government what to do. In a dictatorship, the dictator is at the top, and the dictator tells the people what to do. So I can see many elements of the Chinese dictatorship moving into our democracy and basically polluting our democracy. So right now, I would say we're half a democracy and half a dictatorship.
Well, I've heard you say that we could be edging toward at some point being a colony or a satellite of China. Is that far-fetched, or what are you talking about there, Ken?
Well, there's elements of China that are disturbing elements of China that's permeating our society. The three issues when I look at any government anywhere, I ask myself, how does this government treat life and liberty and the pursuit of happiness? Democracies, the role of the government is to protect life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. In a dictatorship, you don't have any right to life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness, and you have to beg for life and beg for liberty and beg for the pursuit of happiness. So we're a hybrid society where certain elements of the Constitution apply and certain don't apply. And the Supreme Court is basically AWOL in applying the Constitution to the rule of law.
All right.
And so that's why we have such a confused society right now.
All right. My dashboard just lit up with all the people going to disagree with you. But before we get to that and answer our many questions, Juda, you are the crisis manager. What the hell are you going to do about this crisis? The country is tearing apart. How bad is the messaging to either force people apart or bring them together?
You know, your question, I guess to follow up with your question, you have to answer, who am I working for if I'm doing crisis? For Congress, for the country? There's many different questions you could ask on this one. And I think that the Democrats in Congress are doing this for spite and for vengeance and not really paying attention to the legality of it, as Nat and Alan pointed out. There's no grounds for it. For political points, they're just appealing to whatever they think their base is because they know that half the country doesn't agree with it. I don't know what they gain. I think they're afraid of Donald Trump. I think they're afraid of his following, and they're trying to neuter that any way they can. They for some reason think this is the way. People like Jerry Nadler, and who believes himself to be a constitutional scholar as well. And I know Jerry personally for a long time. I just don't agree with a lot of what he's been doing. He seems to think that this is an idealistic mission and he can't say no. If he says no, he's violating his job as a congressman, and he's violating the Constitution by not going forward with this. But they're so blinded by their own idealism and by their own politics, they can't see the forest for the trees. I think this is going to be, I think they pursue this, first of all, egg on their face because they already know Congress, they already know the Senate's not going to vote to convict him. I think they already have that. So they're doing this just as an exercise, and they're hoping maybe they can embarrass Republicans into voting for it. But I don't believe that's going to work. And I think it's going to end up looking bad on them because, once again, we're in coronavirus. They're trying to roll out vaccines as fast as possible. The economies are tanking in many countries, and they're focused on this rather than getting ourselves back in order. But they're focused on this, but also now it's illegal. I can't even say the Kung Flu anymore. If I say Kung Flu, I can get arrested. So they're worrying about petty things, and they're focusing on stupidity and I think it's going to hurt them, but it's going to hurt the country, particularly the people that don't agree with them are going to find some way to rise up or get angry. And I'm not saying violence. I think that it's going to hurt them in 2022, the Democrats, if they keep this up.
All right. Alan, did you want to make one little comment back to Juda?
No.
Okay, good. Let's get to our questions. We got plenty, so we're going to be as quick as we can. The watch party in the villages, I know Ken knows where the villages are. The watch party in the villages says, if the impeachment is so unconstitutional that Chief Justice won't even attend, how can it proceed? And can anyone petition the court to intervene? That, I guess it means the Supreme Court. Nat first, Alan second. Nat.
I think the Supreme Court has shown by what it has done recently with regard to the election disputes that it does not want to get involved. I think that's Chief Justice Roberts has decided that the prestige of the court in the future requires that taking a hands-off policy with regard to all this. So I think it's clear. I mean, there wouldn't be any power really on the part of anybody to prevent the Senate from proceeding with what it is going to do. The consequence of what happens if, and it won't happen, but if, for example, hypothetically, the Senate were to vote to impeach Donald J. Trump, therefore, in theory, making him ineligible for candidacy in 2024, at that point, Donald J. Trump could bring an action if he was planning to run in 2024, claiming that the impeachment was a bill of attainder and a violation of the impeachment clause. And at that point, a court, and presumably ultimately the Supreme Court, as it would be constituted at that point, could rule in his favor or could rule against him. I think.
Alan, what do you say?
I agree for the most part with Nat, except if I were President Trump's lawyer, and I'm not, let me be very clear, I'm not representing President Trump this time around. But if I were his lawyer, I would worry about waiting until 2024 to challenge a Senate conviction on the ground that it was null and void. I would worry that courts, which always look for ways out, would say that it's too late. You should have jumped in earlier. So if I were his lawyer, I'd probably file a lawsuit right after the conviction in the Senate, which is not going to happen, seeking a declaratory judgment, not an injunction, just a declaratory judgment that the verdict is null and void because it was a bill of attainder and because you can't impeach a former president, and therefore allowing him to run if he chose to run. I agree with Nat that I think the court would use every possible avoidance technique, ripeness, overripeness, whatever, to try to avoid jumping in the political thicket. But I think he would be well advised to think about filing that kind of a lawsuit if there were to be a successful verdict conviction in the case.
Also, all right, guys, we got to move on.
Well, let me just say one word, and I agree with Alan that early presentation of the issue would be desirable. I would be concerned that a court would, if he were to bring such a case this year in 2021, that a court would say it's premature. There's no indication that anyone is nominating Donald Trump to run for president. Now, I mean, it would raise the issue of the court's kind of discretionary decision. And I'm afraid, again, because the Supreme Court wants to avoid being involved, that ultimately the Supreme Court would not render a decision because they would say it's too early.
All right, I don't want to spend the whole show on impeachment, but I would say I don't think ripeness is necessarily an issue because he's already said he intends to do something. And second of all, the court says you don't sit on your rights. And so just to come up at the last minute, I think there would have to be a happy medium between what Alan said and what Nat said about when
it doesn't have to be the last minute. But assuming just Joe Blow, who has no chance of ever being nominated, but who raises the question of whether he is a natural-born citizen of the United States, were to bring an action in a federal district court saying, look, I was born to naturalized citizens under certain circumstances in Hawaii. I want the court to decide whether I can run for president. And I think the court would say, that's ridiculous. Nobody's nominating you for president.
All right, I gotta stop it there. Let's go to the next question. This is from the Newton Watch Party. Charles Jacobs, you know where Newton is. What is the damage done by canceling the Keystone XL pipeline? That's the question. So let me first say that the guy who invented the word petropolitics and who has written a couple of books involving oil and pipelines. Oil is dirty, and the Canadian tar sands are about the dirtiest of the dirty. There's about 2 million miles of pipeline in the United States now, and canceling this pipeline only makes us more environmentally unsafe and advantages China. First of all, if the oil doesn't come down in a pipeline, it's going to come down in railroad cars and trucks, and those are going to spill. Every year we have enough big and little spills to make one Exxon Valdez. Second of all that oil is now going to be transferred over to the Trans Mountain Pipeline, which is going to go to Vancouver and from there to China. So China's going to get this oil. China wants this oil. We tried to keep it out of China's hands. We got an advantageous price, and now that's going to be undone. And this Trans Mountain Pipeline has already had about 80 to 100 spills due to the corrosive nature of the oil. So I've answered that. Oh, by the way, the 11,000 people who just got laid off, they're not going to be making windmills next week. So they're not going to have jobs. Let's go to Francine in Sarasota. If the intelligence community foments and encourages people to engage in violence, how might this work, and could this have been at play January 6th at the Capitol? Well, we all know that what the intelligence community does is they interpose themselves into conversations, and they say, yeah, we should blow this place up, and they try to draw people out. And so I think what you'd start seeing is fomenters who are not only doing this at mosques, but who might be in certain churches and party organizations trying to draw people out. Quickly, Alan, you know something about this apparatus. Could the IC start fomenting domestic conservatives and trying to nail them? What's going on?
Well, Nat and I have something in common. The acting head of the CIA is somebody who I grew up with, my son's best friend, and I recommended him to Nat as a lawyer when he graduated Yale Law School, and he worked for Nat. This is David Cohen, who is now the acting director of the CIA, soon to be the deputy director of the CIA. I think Nat will agree with me that David is an honorable and very decent and very thoughtful and intelligent young man. And I can't imagine that under his watch, we would be seeing any of these so-called deep state machinations. Having said that, of course, the director and the deputy director of the CIA don't know everything that goes on within that organization. But Nat, you know David Cohen. What do you think?
Well, I have just the very highest regard for David. He worked with me on Alan's recommendation. Our firm took him on. We were delighted to do that. And he worked with me in a number of cases. And particularly, Alan has mentioned the whole question of menorahs in public places. David worked on a number of menorah litigations with me during the period of time that he was at our law firm. He's one of our law firm was fortunate enough to have very many distinguished alumni. Seth Waxman, who was Solicitor General in the Clinton administration, Jamie Gorelick, who was a Deputy Attorney General. So we're very proud of our alumni, and David is particularly, his work on the menorah cases led me, when I sent him a congratulatory note, to say that the CIA should now be renamed the letters CIA to stand for Chabad Incendiary Attorneys.
Okay, now wait a minute. I want to tell both you guys that irrespective of your knowledge of David Cohen and the CIA, I think that domestic surveillance and fomenting will not take place through the CIA, but basically through a small inner working group at the National Security Council and working with Homeland Security, since the CIA has a charter that says it can't operate within the United States. So they'll probably just pass stuff on.
They get the Europeans, Edwin. They get the Europeans to do it.
Exactly. That's right.
But remember who the heads of these organizations are. The head of National Security, the Secretary of Homeland Security are all very highly regarded people. Interestingly enough, my recollection is both of them are come from strong Jewish backgrounds. This is an administration that I think will have a lot of very, very accomplished, very bright people. It doesn't mean that they can control everything that happens under their watch, but I am very comfortable with almost all of the Biden appointments, with one exception, Kristen Clark, Assistant Secretary for the Civil Rights Division, who has a long history of cavorting with anti-Semitism. And I'm hoping that the president will rethink that appointment. But short of that appointment, I'm relatively happy with all
Don't
the rest.
forget Rob Malley, Alan.
Yeah.
Rob Malley would be terrible on Iran.
Hey, Josh,
Yeah.
open up your camera. Let's see you. Malley's a problem. Hey, Ken, now you're active in many conservative groups, Ken. Are you now going to worry that when you're trying to express your opinion, that one of your chat groups or your conservative groups, that actually you're speaking to someone who's trying to catch you up or trying to surveil you? What do you think?
Well, I'm very worried because there's a lot of elements of police state action going on under the Biden administration. And they're basically violating freedom of speech. And soon I'm sure they'll start violating the Second Amendment. They regard the Constitution as basically an optional document to look at if they have time. And so it's very disturbing. Also, number two, they're not going after the real enemies. They're looking at pretend enemies, which don't exist. And they're not going after the Antifa, anarchists, and BLM. Those are the terrorists. And they're because they're a part of the Democrat Party. They're illegal.
Well, you're not going to say, now we can't say the whole BLM is a terrorist group. I think what you mean is the extreme fringe of the BLM, correct?
Okay, fine. But the Democrat Party hasn't repudiated them. And they're basically the shock troops, illegal shock troops
People are the white supremacists.
of the Democrat Party. That's what the FBI should go after.
I think that overstates it. I think there are bad, to paraphrase the president, there are bad people on all sides. And I think the right wing has to be concerned about white supremacists and white nationalists and neo-Nazis. And I think the left have to be concerned about Antifa and other extremists. And I think all of us join together in wanting to move our country more to the center. And we each have our jobs to do. As a person who's a liberal, I focus much more on the hard left and trying to marginalize them. Conservatives ought to be focusing more on the hard right and trying to marginalize them. But I think our joint goal is to marginalize extremists on both sides.
And I think that what Alan just said is quite right, because we are trying to find the common ground, the place in the middle that can be restored. Well said, Alan. And Ken, we have another question that actually is right in your wheelhouse. Raymond in Atlanta wants to know, can you tell us more about the Chinese Confucius centers and how they compromise national security? Could you give us just a 1 minute on that? Because I know you wrote about that in your book, The Multifront War.
Well, the Chinese are probably doing 100 things to compromise the integrity and independence of America, and that's just one of them. So what they do is they have about almost 100 Confucius Institutes in the universities. They also have programs in the K through 12 and the high schools. And they theoretically are teaching people Chinese or the wonderful nature of the Chinese society, which is a dictatorship and is determined to destroy America. So why we have any of these institutes anywhere in America is beyond me. The Chinese also supply money for researchers in the university level. They have something called the 1,000 Talents Program, and they identify very talented people, pay them, and then take the technology back to China. The influence of China is enormous, and it should, by the way, politicians cannot take money from foreign sources. We should have, same for universities. No university should be able to take any money from any foreign source, whether it's Chinese money or Middle East money. And by the way, the universities even are supposed to report money that comes in, and they don't even report the money coming in because the universities are corrupt to the core.
All right, let's get to our next question. Douglas in Houston. Do we even need Twitter or Facebook, or would America and the world be better off without them? First of all, I'm the wrong person to ask because I couldn't care less about Twitter. I think it's a great big waste of time. But I'm going to ask Josh very briefly, and then Judah, you're the two social media guys. Quickly, Josh, what do you say?
I mean, every survey now shows us that people who spend more time on social media are less happy, and that people congregate among self-selected silos of like-minded individuals and reinforce often misinformation in those isolated silos and don't seek out information that challenges their beliefs. So there's no question that these things have had negative effects. Then again, a lot of grandparents get to see their grandchildren on FaceTime and on Facebook or whatever, that especially during COVID, that they might not otherwise. So there are social values and there are social drawbacks. And the question is, how do we as a society handle these things and police our own behavior? The problem with social media is that individuals will go on and make comments they would never make as individuals. They act out in groups in ways that we would never act as people. It wasn't that long ago we did away with the stockade. We did away with the stockade because it was such an ineffective punishment, embarrassment, and shame. It was pretty effective, actually. We did away with it because it turned the rest of us into animals. We would throw things in as a mob, we congregate and act out in a mob against people in ways we never would interpersonally. And I think social media creates that same dynamic. And it's quite worrisome. It's not good for politics. It's not good interpersonally. And I think there are some challenges, though. On the other hand, this is the free market. We need to find ways to compensate with that as a society.
Okay, now before I go to Judah, just a moment. This is my Jerusalem cup, Alan. I know you'll recognize it.
Just make sure you write bracha.
Okay. So
can I comment on that? Because I unfortunately have to leave in a minute. So this is going to be my comment if I can. There's a great cartoon a few years ago which showed a young man coming to his father's shop. His father made scrolls, like Torah scrolls. And the young man comes in and shows him a new invention, a book. And the father says, oh my God, this is the end of our society, our end of our civilization. We always think that new technology is going to destroy our society. We have the internet. It's going to stay with us. It's not going to change. It poses the most compelling First Amendment issues in my lifetime, because it is censoring, it is controlling what we read and see, and yet they have their First Amendment rights to censor and control. So we can't use the law to try to stop the social media from doing the damage which we know they're doing. We have to defeat their censorship in the marketplace of ideas. I'm writing a book now called basically, How Do We Protect the First Amendment from the, quote, progressive censors that are using the social media to cancel culture and do all of that. It's one of the greatest challenges we face. There's no clear answer, but we can't hide our face in the sand. The social media is going to have a major impact.
Before you commented, I was going to say, when Gutenberg started printing, everything was fine. He ran a Bible. But
wait a minute. I have in my house hanging, just to remind me, 1492, a poster printed in 1492, right after Gutenberg invented the printing press. And what is it? It's a blood libel against the Jews, claiming they kill Christian children. And it has a drawing of a rabbi bleeding a Christian child and the blood pouring onto a matzah. That was the first thing that Gutenberg's press was used to do to create a blood libel. We always have to remember that every good invention will be used for bad, including podcasts. But I have to go now, unfortunately. I didn't realize that we were going beyond 4 o'clock.
All right, Alan.
I love being on your show. And
all right, Alan. You go. I'll tell you what Nat said later. Have a good time on the Dershow, and I'll see you there. And we'll keep everybody around. We'll go right to Judah. Judah, what the heck? Do we need this Twitter and this Facebook? Are we better off or worse off or what?
So that's no longer a question. Do we need it anymore? We have it. And like everyone else said, it's here to stay. We're not getting rid of it. And I think just like the stockades, like Josh brought up earlier, eventually we're going to find a balance and a way of using it properly, protecting our First Amendment rights while protecting the First Amendment rights of people to post on there as well as the censors on there. I think that there's so many different issues on it, and I don't want to say yes or no. Do we need it? Yes, we need it. Marketers need it. Retailers need it. Businesses need it. It's the only way to get your message across these days. Nobody watches television commercials anymore. So the best way to do it is through the internet and advertising. And that's what Twitter and Facebook and Google are all used for the most part. Eventually this time in our history is showing us that we need to figure out a way of regulating it. We need to figure out a way of understanding it and helping people figure out their way around, right? It's too new. And right now it's too controlled by one side. But do we need it? Yes, I'm afraid we need it. And we're not getting rid of it.
All right, let's move on to another question. We have one from Wes in the Bay Area. He says, he's probably aiming this at Nat. How is impeachment punishment when Trump has already left office? So his question is, how do you punish him? You can't remove him. I mean, it's kind of a catch-22, but what's the answer? It was begun while he was president. Now he's not. So what would you say? It's moot?
No. The answer is it's punishment in the same way as in the leading Supreme Court case before Nixon. It was punishment to say that Archie Brown could not hold office in a union because he was found to be a member of the Communist Party. The Supreme Court said that disqualification from office in a union is punishment. If that's punishment, disqualification from being president of the United States is certainly punishment. And that's so obvious. And that's the reason why the Democratic members of the Senate want to find Donald J. Trump guilty, because they want to disqualify him from running in 2024. So that's the punishment. But as long as I've got the floor, let me get back to what Alan said before he left and what was a previous discussion. You talked about the Gutenberg Bible and about movable type. Today, social platforms are the means of communication that over the years, over the generations, over the centuries have advanced. There used to be a time when the only way you could communicate was hieroglyphics, maybe banging into stone. You could speak to people, but otherwise you wanted to talk to them. Then they got writing. You could send letters. You could send scrolls to people. When the founding fathers, when the United States was created, the press was the way. Extreme statements were being made by anybody who owned a printing press. That's what gave you the ability to get to people, either in a public forum or in writing. Nowadays, I look at my grandchildren, they don't bother reading newspapers or what's in print. They work on the basis of what's on the internet, the social media. That's how we communicate today. And therefore, it seems to me that if you deny the social media to anybody, it's like eliminating the printing press. It's like eliminating ink and paper, because people can't communicate. Communicating today is done on Twitter, on Facebook. That's how the upcoming...
So what you're saying is what many people are saying, is that the social platforms are really like telephones, and they should be regulated like utilities. Let's move on. Reggie in London, Great Britain. I just heard AOC. Wow, they really know the abbreviations in Britain. I just heard AOC widen the definition of dangerous white supremacist and says it now includes what she called sympathizers, which she implied included many elected Republicans. Did not the Republicans in America knowingly appeal to the right-wing fringe? Ken, you're the right man for that. Did the Republicans not knowingly appeal to the crazy people who dressed up in goofy outfits and photographed themselves stealing furniture? I mean, that Antifa doesn't show itself stealing furniture. So what about that? Did the Republican Party deliberately appeal to all this? And then I'll ask Judah, is it fair to lump in all the Republicans with these guys. So first to you, Ken, what about this right-wing craziness?
Okay, this is all part of the false narrative of the left. I'm a financial guy. Let's give you some numbers. Roughly 1% of the problem of lawlessness facing this country is from the right wing, and 99% is from the left wing. So let's keep things in perspective. Number two, the so-called right wing, or the extreme right wing, whatever you want to call it, has no candidates in the Republican Party, has no credibility, and no one listens to them in the Republican Party. Trump all the way down. Whereas the left-wing crazies, the two, which should be illegal terror organizations, Antifa and BLM, are embraced by the Democrats, and the Islamists are embraced by the Democrats. They're represented by the Democrats. They're represented in the House and the Senate. So it's the Democrats that have a problem.
Now,
with
these
terrorism.
sweeping generalizations are the type that we have to watch, because I can tell you right now, I have many friends in the BLM, and I have many friends in the Republican and Democratic world, and they're not all crazy Antifa people. They're not all crazy right-wing guys who dress up with horns on their head. But I understand what you're saying, and this is precisely what is going on in this country. We are being torn apart because, as Josh said, we're all in silos. Josh, you have to leave in about 2 minutes. Open up your camera and give us your final comment on what was just said.
Well, I think you really wanting to find the rational conversation again, and I think this is the challenge. First, I'd say as Jews, we have a particular history and we have a particular interest in facts and history being recognized universally. So there's a clear definition of what's been going on and what's important. What we see on the far left is an effort to undo history and rewrite the rules, to rewrite outcomes, not to create a flat meritocracy and a starting point even, but to create even outcomes by readjusting, rejiggering things along the way. And on the extreme right, whether it's the Tea Party or the extreme right, they want to upend society in their own way. We do the gold standard, black helicopters, and now these guys are so crazy around the right and the left. They meet around the back, and they come together in an isolationist, very nasty worldview. And I think we need to be careful that we don't neglect the obligation as a society to build credible, centrist, honest institutions that can help define facts and put out, what becomes a common understanding. Otherwise, we're going to lose that frame of reference and become even more deeply polarized. So I think
if I could just say, one of the strengths of Ken's book, The Multifront War, was that he spoke about the extreme left and the extreme right, just as you said, Josh, and how they make a horseshoe and they get very close to each other right at the polarized ends. I think that's a great point. So where's your son? You're supposed to be back there giving you moral support.
He's off at baseball.
Okay, you have to cut. We'll see you next time, and we're going to take another question here. Dorothy in San Francisco. Why did Biden suspend F-35 sales to the UAE? How did this help peace in the region? Okay, I'll make a comment here. This was completely against any progress in peace. It was completely unnecessary. The sales of the F-35 to the UAE were not due for years. I mean, it isn't that they're happening around the corner. They were not due for years. I think that this was a token slap in the face from the Biden administration to the Israeli peace and Trump peace effort to placate the Palestinians and the PLO. It was a completely unnecessary security review and pause. And Judah, what do you say?
I agree with you. I think that was done as a way of saying the Abraham Accords aren't going to live. I think it's what John Kerry wants to see. I think they want to prove that they're right. The Palestinians are going to get their funding back, and they're going to be part of the solution. If they're not part of the solution, then there's not going to be any solution. That's what Biden said originally. That's what John Kerry said originally, and now they're going to push as far as they can to see if they can make that happen.
Right.
Because they don't like. It's for two reasons. One is because they're devoted to this two-state process. But also, they don't want any part of Trump's legacy to look good in the end. And if they can whittle away at everything he's done, including the Abraham Accords, they will, and they'll ultimately change history and rewrite and blame him for all the failures.
You know, I think that's completely correct. Ken, very briefly, what do you think about this unnecessary move to block the F-35s, which weren't even ready to be transferred, at least for several years, as Ambassador Friedman said? Briefly, what do you think about that?
Well, the Biden administration is basically a rogue administration, and they're basically supporting all of our enemies. So they're indirectly supporting Iran. They're indirectly supporting the Muslim Brotherhood, Turkey and Qatar. They're indirectly supporting Russia and China. So basically, they don't want the Sunni Muslim countries to be strong because they want them to be intimidated by Iran, Turkey, and Qatar, who are enemies of America and enemies of Western civilization. It's a purposeful, rogue administration with purposely rogue policies.
Okay, so let's now go to Maddie in Chicago. She wants to know the 11,000 people Biden just put out of a job that's on the Keystone Pipeline. What do those families do next week? I'll just make a comment here that to say, well, they're going to build solar panels and windmills is just a huge insult. These people are losing their job today and next week, won't have food to put on the table. And I can tell you that windmills and solar panels are years away. And by the way, they're not green, they're brown green. It takes heavy industry, dirty industry, polluting industry to make a windmill, to make a solar panel. The jobs are half the cost. Once again, this goes to China because the solar panels are made at China. And I just get a number here. The number of permanent jobs on the Keystone Pipeline was 35. That's not correct. That is not correct. I've seen the layout information, so that is an unnecessary. It is not possible. Somebody just emailed me a note, chatted a note, that we could have hundreds of miles of pipeline and only 35 people are being put out of a job. That's not possible. So I know Wes is concerned with fact-free. That's pretty fact-free. Bess in New York, what types of legal challenges to domestic surveillance might we see? Google knows everything, and Google can be subpoenaed and complies with those subpoenas. Nat Lewin, you've been fighting for civil rights for many decades, even longer than I've been fighting for civil rights, if that can be believed. And so when it becomes too intense, too invasive, what recourse do people have to the courts, especially since many people no longer trust the courts? Go ahead.
The legal recourse would be to bring lawsuits against the intrusions on privacy. And you'd have to demonstrate how exactly that does intrude on your privacy. That's the problem. I mean, inhospitable courts, judges can find procedural ways for rejecting lawsuits that are brought about invasions of privacy that result from Twitter or Google or whatever is doing. I mean, there are efforts now, and I know we have gotten notices on our telephones about how we can take steps to try to prevent various kinds of intrusions, but they come so very late. I mean, I've become reconciled to the fact that there's just about nothing that's private in our world today, that just about everything I do and wherever I do it is subject to, intrusion from some outside source. How are we going to correct that? Legislation could try to correct that. Litigation could try to prevent that, but it's not going to be easy.
All right, here's Becky in Charleston. Will Israel attack Iran's nuclear program? I would say, in my opinion, Israel is a lot closer to attacking the Iranian program today than it was 3 weeks ago or at New Year's Eve. I think that they feel they've got enough momentum from the prior administration and want to move quickly. And we may see something very soon in the Middle East that many of us have worried about for many a year. Jacob in San Diego, will the Civil War move from rhetoric to violence, and when? So let me start with Judah. Do you think that the uncivil war is going to actually become a civil war?
You know what? I always like to think the best of people and think that that's not what America wants. It really depends on how this Biden administration and the Democrats in Congress conduct themselves over the next 2 years. If it's going to be completely to erase everything that they believe should have happened or happened under the Trump administration, anything that they believe was progress or good, if they just want to wipe it all out and ignore half of the country, it could very well lead to that. And it could start out in areas where people feel, just like there are those who believe and those who know that that minorities in a lot of communities in America are disenfranchised communities. There are plenty of white populations in small towns around America that are just as disenfranchised, just as unemployed, and just as desperate. And they believe their hopes were on the other side. And I believe it's possible that there can be more violence. I don't foresee that right now yet, but I don't rule it out as a possibility if they feel their voices are completely being ignored, nothing they say matters, and everything they do gets undone.
Are you saying basically if one half of the country feels they no longer have access to what they used to call democracy?
Listen, you saw it on the left when the left believed that during the summer and during the some of the tense moments in our urban areas over the killing of George Floyd and some other issues. They believe that their only power was insurrection. I believe that too, and you will see it. I mean, right, if this goes on.
All right, Ken, very quickly. It's an uncivil war now. Do you think it has the potential to become a genuine civil war, a physical civil war? Very, very briefly, because we're out of time.
Look, the Democrats are the reincarnation of the Confederates. Okay, and the Confederates declared war against the North in 1861, and they lost. Now they came back through the questionable ballot box. And so the question is, will the Union, so to speak, will Abraham Lincoln, the next Abraham Lincoln, basically defeat the Confederates a second time? I think it'll be done in the ballot box. I don't think Americans want to go through the killing process of the first Civil War and in the second Civil War. So, all right,
that's a little bit of hope. And I know you're referring to the fact that the Democrats were originally the party of slavery, the party of the Confederates, and the party of the Dixiecrats right up through the middle of the 20th century. Nat, very, very quickly, you're a man who's always tried to empower people to have their rights. You believe in this country. Is the uncivil war going to become a true civil war?
I think the danger of that happening is more from the left as it is. I mean, you had the discussion before about whether the conservatives are encouraging the crazies on the right to engage in violence. I think we've already seen that what has happened as a result of the statements that are being made by the Squad, by AOC, by the left, by Nancy Pelosi. There's violence in Seattle. There's violence in Portland. There's violence in Denver. That's where it's likely to degenerate into violence, not because the Trumpers with their big signs saying we want Trump in 2024 or whenever, are going to be creating violence. It's because of the actions that are taking place that we see in Portland and Seattle and Denver and in New York City, where they're breaking windows as peaceful protesters. That's the violence that can start.
Okay. Listen, guys, we're going to have to call it there. I must say this was an extraordinary show. We're out of time. We're going to see everybody next week at 3 p.m. Eastern. Until then, head over to any Barnes & Noble in the USA or any Amazon platform in 190 countries across this planet where you can find any of my 200 book editions, such as IBM and the Holocaust, War Against the Weak, and Financing the Flames. Get passwords and access to participate live in future shows at theedwinblackshow.com. You'll see a much enhanced and produced version of this episode and prior episodes by subscribing to our YouTube channel at The Edwin Black Show. Click that notification button. Follow me at Edwin Black Book on Twitter and Facebook. I am now zooming out. I want to thank my great guests. Thank you, everybody. See you next week.